Days Gone was declared dead on arrival. Critics called it generic, Sony quietly buried the sequel, the studio that made it got handed a live service project which also got cancelled, and then came the layoffs. So the game, the franchise and the studio all lost at the same time. But in 2026, Days Gone is still thriving. Not in a game as a service way, but rather in an organic way. People rediscover it thanks to the word of mouth and actually enjoy playing it. I played it at launch on PS4 and I just finished the remastered version a few weeks ago and loved it both times despite the issues. And both times I wondered why there was no sequel to this game after 7 years. So let's actually investigate what happened to Days Gone. Days Gone launched April 26, 2019 on PS4. It debuted as the second best-selling game in North America that month behind only Mortal Kombat 11. It was the 7th highest debut in sales for any Sony published title in history. By June 2019, 2 months in, it was the 8th best-selling game of the entire year. By the time Jeff Ross, one of the game's directors, left Bend Studio in late 2020, the game had sold conservatively over 7 million units. Sony's own internal sales data, leaked via the Insomniac ransomware attack in 2023, confirmed 7.32 million copies sold on PlayStation alone by February 2022. The PC port, which launched in May 2021, added further sales on top of that, making Days Gone Sony's third best-selling PC release at the time, behind only God of War and Horizon Zero Dawn. By any commercial metric, Days Gone was a success, and Sony still killed the sequel. So why? The answer starts with one number: 71. That's Days Gone's Metacritic score on PS4. For context, Ghost of Tsushima, released a year later in July 2020, scored an 83 and has gone to sell over 9.5 million copies. God of War 2018 scored a 94 and The Last of Us Part 2 scored a 93. Sony's prestige slate during this era was not just successful commercially, it was critically dominant. John Garvin, Days Gone's creative director, said it himself publicly: "If you're the creative director on a franchise and your game is coming out to a 70 on Metacritic, you're not going to be the creative director on that franchise for very long." He wasn't speaking hypothetically, he was describing what actually happened to him. But the Metacritic score doesn't exist in a vacuum, it needs context. Days Gone launched in a broken state. Frame rate issues, crashes, bugs across the board. Many critics reviewed a game that by the time most players actually bought it had already been significantly patched. The score captured the launch window that the game's own creators were still fixing, and once it was fixed, the player response was drastically different. On Steam, where the game launched 2 years later in a polished state, it currently holds over 91% positive rating from over 110,000 user reviews. The original PS4 version launched with a 71 on Metacritic from over 100 outlets. That number didn't stay still. The PC port in 2021 pushed the score to 76. The PS5 remaster in 2025 landed at 78. And on OpenCritic, it scored an 81 with 75% recommending it. The same game, reviewed 3 times, improved its critical score each time without changing a single line of its story or a single design decision. The critics kept warming up to something they'd already dismissed. Now, look at what players were doing the whole time. The original PS4 version carries a Metacritic user score of 8.5 from over 12,000 reviews. The PC version on Steam sits at about 92% positive from over 110,000 players. And the PS5 remaster launched to an 8.8 user score. Every single audience, every single platform, every single version, players consistently rated this game far above where critics placed it, and critics themselves have been slowly, quietly catching up. The franchise didn't change, the audience's opinion of it didn't change. What changed is that the noise from a broken launch finally faded, and what was underneath it turned out to be exactly what players said it was. There's a second factor in the critical reception that rarely gets examined directly. Days Gone was compared to The Last of Us constantly, and not favorably. In the year it launched, the discourse around PlayStation exclusives was shaped almost entirely by what Naughty Dog had established. The benchmark for a Sony first-party narrative game was Joel and Ellie. Everything else was measured against that. Days Gone is not The Last of Us and it never tried to be. It's a biker survival game set in Oregon, built around a motorcycle, a horde mechanic, and an anti-hero who is deliberately difficult to like. The closest surface comparison to The Last of Us is right there, a post-apocalyptic world, infected enemies, broken men trying to survive, and if you squint, sure, you can see why the comparison got made, but a shared aesthetic is not a shared identity. Sons of Anarchy and The Walking Dead are just as much in Days Gone's DNA. The biker brotherhood, the moral ambiguity, the survival without heroism, these are fundamentally different stories told in fundamentally different ways. But here's where it becomes more than just critical framing. Jeff Ross stated publicly that Herman Hulse, who was then the head of PlayStation Studios, was against the Days Gone sequel partly because Sony's portfolio already had a zombie franchise, and that franchise was The Last of Us. Why would Sony found a second zombie IP that scored a 71 when it already had one that scored a 95 and won Game of the Year? From a portfolio management standpoint, that logic is not irrational. But from a creative standpoint, it completely collapses the distinction between two games that share nothing except the existence of infected enemies. The Last of Us is a linear, narrative-driven survival horror, while Days Gone is a slow-burn open-world survival game where you manage fuel, build a bike, and fight hordes of infected while dealing with the human enemies. They're not the same game. They were never competing for the same player. But in Sony's internal calculus, they apparently occupied the same portfolio slot, and The Last of Us won. To understand why Days Gone lost, you have to understand what was happening at Sony in the same year it launched. Sean Layden was the chairman of SIE Worldwide Studios, effectively the executive champion for Sony's first-party developers. In a January 2022 livestream with David Jaffe, creator of the original God of War, Jeff Ross was direct about what Layden's departure meant for the franchise.
Yeah, no. What I will say though regarding Sean, as soon as Sean was gone, Days Gone was dead. The two events were almost simultaneous.
As soon as Sean was gone, Days Gone was dead. Layden left Sony in September 2019, 5 months after the game launched. What replaced Layden's era was a strategic shift that has since been extensively documented. Jim Ryan became CEO of Sony Interactive Entertainment. Sony's first-party strategy during the Jim Ryan era operated in 2 phases, and Days Gone got caught by both of them. In the first phase, the benchmark was prestige, Metacritic scores, awards, and cinematic blockbusters. Days Gone scored a 71 and got left behind. The studio was split with one team supporting Naughty Dog's Last of Us multiplayer project, and another working on an Uncharted spin-off that never made it past early concepts. Then came Phase 2. In 2022, Ryan publicly committed to 12 live service titles by 2026. Bend got swept in that wave, and the studio was redirected to a live service multiplayer project, which also got cancelled and led to the layoffs. The Phase 2 strategy was the same one that produced Concord, a game that launched in August 2024 and was taken offline 12 days later after selling an estimated 25,000 copies. Sony has since cancelled 8 live service projects in total, and the pivot Ryan built is now being dismantled by the people who inherited it. During that time, Shuhei Yoshida, who had been president of Worldwide Studios for over a decade, the executive who helped build God of War, Uncharted, and Ghost of Tsushima, was demoted. Speaking at Australia's Alt Games Festival in 2026, Yoshida confirmed he was effectively fired from his role. His departure followed his resistance to directives from Ryan's new leadership structure. Sean Layden himself, in a later podcast interview, explained his own exit without ambiguity. Sony was making strategic decisions with a heavy emphasis on games as a service, live service gaming, subscription formulas, and recurring revenue. And according to him, that was kinda not his wheelhouse. So the executives who understood and championed the kind of games Days Gone was, single player, new IP, mid-range critical success, were being systematically replaced by a leadership structure that was chasing a different business entirely. Days Gone didn't just miss the Metacritic threshold, it launched into a leadership transition that made its genre, its score, and its trajectory almost impossible to defend internally. In 2021, it was reported that Bend Studio had pitched a Days Gone sequel to Sony, but the pitch was rejected. Then, Bend Studio, the team that had spent 6 years building Days Gone, almost tripling in size from 50 to 130 developers, producing their first open-world game and their first original IP since Siphon Filter in 1999, was redirected. Not toward the sequel they had built the foundation for, not toward the open world systems they had spent years developing, but toward a live service multiplayer project. Leaked UI concept art from December 2024 suggested it was shaping up to be a live service military shooter. John Garvin and Jeff Ross, the creative director and game director of Days Gone, both left Bend Studio in 2020 in the wake of the sequel rejection. The team that knew the game most intimately was gone before the replacement project even had a name. Then in January 2025, Sony cancelled Bend Studio's live service project entirely. The game had been in development for approximately 3 years without producing anything releasable. An internal animator who had worked at the studio confirmed on social media that the project hadn't made substantial progress in that time. And then, the cancellation was followed immediately by layoffs. Approximately 30% of Bend Studio's staff, or around 40 people. Ross claimed publicly in 2024 that Sony had spent over $250 million on Bend's cancelled project. That figure has not been confirmed by Sony, but the basic sequence of events is not disputed. Sony rejected the sequel to a game that sold over 7 million copies, redirected the studio toward a live service game that never shipped, spent years of development time on it, then cancelled it and laid off a third of the studio. For comparison, a Days Gone sequel, according to Ross, would have had a budget of approximately $150 million. Similar to the original game, the cancelled project reportedly cost more than that without ever releasing. But there's one more factor worth being honest about. Days Gone's lengthy development process. 6 years of dev time and multiple delays from a studio simultaneously building its first open world game, first home console release since 2007, and first original IP since Siphon Filter. Garvin himself admitted in 2022 that budget constraints directly affected the game's AI, story pacing, and boss fights. Also, Ross revealed that one engineer was responsible for all animation systems, physics, the motorcycle, and the horde. While that's extraordinary, it also tells you exactly how stretched the studio was. Sony looked at the game's development cycle, its launch status, and the critics' reception, and decided the risk of doing it again was too high. That's a business calculation, and the community spent over 6 years proving it was the wrong one. In April 2025, Sony released Days Gone Remastered for PS5. It included new features such as improved lighting, frame rate stability, DualSense support, and more. The upgrade from the PS4 version cost existing owners $10. It didn't restore the cut regions, it didn't add the co-op system from the original Peach, it didn't fix the fade to black cutscenes, which are a technical limitation embedded so deeply in the original codebase that addressing them would require rebuilding substantial sections of the game's cinematic structure. And multiple critics noted that the remaster felt more like a symbolic gesture than a creative investment. That's what the remaster tells you when you look at it, actually. Not that Sony believed in Days Gone enough to invest in restoring what it could have been, but that Sony believed in the IP enough to keep it commercially visible while other pieces are figured out. Sony currently has a Days Gone film in development at Sony PlayStation Production. The film has been quiet since its announcement in 2022, but it has not been cancelled. Not yet, at least. The remaster keeps the IP commercially visible while the film is developed. It signals to the market that Days Gone is an active property without committing to a sequel or a remake. It costs significantly less than a new game, and if the film performs, it potentially justifies the sequel investment that was rejected in 2021. This is IP maintenance, not creative investment. The game that sold 7 million copies and whose community has been growing for over 6 years still does not have a confirmed sequel. The people who made it are gone. The studio that built it has been restructured, and the franchise exists primarily now as a potential film property. So based on the evidence, Days Gone was not killed because it was a bad game. Actually, when you look at it, the game sold over 7 million copies, so it wasn't a commercial failure. It's a fan favorite title and people enjoy its world, mechanics, and story. Visually, it still holds up pretty well with incredible cinematic cutscenes. So why did Sony kill Days Gone? The answer comes down to a broken launch that poisoned the critical conversation permanently, a Metacritic score that became Sony's internal verdict regardless of what came after, and an unfair comparison to a franchise it was never built to compete with. Add the departure of the executives who believed in it, the loss of its own creative directors, and a publisher that kept redirecting the studio toward projects that had nothing to do with Days Gone, and the sequel never had a chance, at least not yet. Whether the community eventually gets a Days Gone 2 depends entirely on whether the film performs, whether Sony's post-Jim Ryan leadership views the IP differently, and whether enough of the original team can be reassembled to make the game that the original vision was always pointing toward. None of those things are guaranteed. Some of them look increasingly unlikely, but the game is still here, still being played and still pulling people into Oregon in 2026. Sony killed Days Gone, but the game survived anyway. And that might be the most Deacon St. John ending this story could have had. Do you think Sony should greenlight Days Gone 2? Or has too much time passed? Too many of the right people have left for it to matter? Let me know in the comments.